Roll the credits, the story's not over yet. Pull up a chair, let's unpack the ending. Every finale leaves a clue. Come find the meaning with us.
Hey, I'm Jazmin, and welcome to episode 2 of the Finale Compass. You ever hit a point in your life or career where it felt like everything you built was like actively dissolving into nothing? Well, today's episode is for you. We are shifting gears from television crime dramas to the world of 80s fantasy cinema to audit the climax of the NeverEnding Story. We're breaking down how a boy, a luck dragon, and a single grain of sand hold the ultimate blueprint for rebuilding your goals when your world gets turned completely upside down. So just to recap a little bit about me, if you're new here, here's a quick look of who I am. By day, I have worked in HR, in government and corporate life for over 25 years. But long before I was dealing with like workplace dynamics, I was just a kid who was totally obsessed with stories and music, books, and movies and all entertainment, like anything. Today, I'm bringing those two worlds together to look at all the favorites through a learning and reasoning lens. So now we get to the part where we recap the actual movie. If you ever wanted to see this movie because you heard the song being sung by two kids in the Netflix show Stranger Things and you haven't watched the movie, just beware, there's going to be a few spoilers. So the NeverEnding Story follows Bastian, a lonely boy grieving his mother. He's dealing with bullies at school. He just doesn't know how to connect because he's going through all these different things. He stumbles upon a magical book at a bookstore. Fascinated by the symbol on the cover of the book salesperson tells him, "Oh, you can't read that." And, Bastian, being a kid, we're all interested in wanting to like learn about things and, curiosity killed the cat. He took the book and he started reading about the book. And you find out that it's a very magical book and it makes the reader feel like they are in the fantasy world called Fantasia. The world is being consumed by a terrifying force called the Nothing in the book, which represents the despair of the real world losing its imagination, hopes, and dreams. Bastian goes to read about a young warrior named Atreyo, who is tasked with finding a cure to save the childlike Empress and stop this destruction and, getting rid of Fantasia. Throughout the story, we watch the slow, agonizing decay of Fantasia. Great civilizations and ancient creatures are swallowed whole by dark, empty voids. The closer Atreyo gets to his goal, the more intense the destruction becomes, culminating in the tragic loss of his companion Artax. If you remember the horse, or if you don't, the horse got stuck in quicksand and eventually sunk all the way and disappears. Such one of the heartbreaking moments of the movie. And the literal shattering of the world's physical boundaries. It's a slow motion collapse where the characters watch everything they know turn to dust. Very similar to if you ever watch Marvel's MCU Infinity War and Endgame, where Thanos snapped his fingers and everybody turned to dust. They just disappeared into nothing. Kind of the same idea. The final scene in the NeverEnding Story, Fantasia is completely gone, except for a tiny glowing grain of sand held by the childlike Empress. Bastian, realizing he's a part of the story, finally speaks up and gives the Empress a new name, breaking the curse. He is brought face to face with her in the void, where she hands him the grain of sand and tells him that Fantasia can be completely rebuilt from his wishes, dreams, and imagination. Bastian begins to wish. Fantasia roars back to life, and he flies through a restored, vibrant world on the back of Falcor, who is a luck dragon throughout the book and the movie, the book that he's reading in the movie. So with that being said, he ends up saving this world that he feels like he was a part of, that he felt like very connected to. And that's kind of the idea, is that you can take something out of nothing and turn it into something. All is not lost at the end of the day. So that is the recap of the NeverEnding Story, the movie, because there was a book version of it, but we're talking about the movie. So now we're going to go into relating the finale points of the movie to real experiences. So the first point we're going to talk about is the nothing. I talked about it earlier, the nothing that just kind of devoured the whole of Fantasia. So we're going to be talking about the nothing versus the creative burnout, right? So the movie element is that the nothing is an invisible, creeping void that destroys Fantasia, not with fire or weapons, but by simply making things cease to exist because humans have given up on their dreams and wishes and goals and everything. So that's how the nothing is like working in the book. Everything outside of it is people are losing their hopes and dreams, and therefore the book is kind of being erased and the world of Fantasia is being dissolved into nothingness. So that is the premise. That is one of the elements. So when we're talking about comparing that to real life, this is what happens when we abandon our personal goals and let routine take over. When you stop chasing what lights you up, your ambition doesn't vanish in like a dramatic explosion. It solely dissolves into apathy and daily autopilot. The nothing is the comfort zone that quietly eats away at your potential because you stop dreaming. So just let me use an example. I worked in the military for over 20 years. And at some point in my career, and this happens in any career that you go to, if you feel like that it's not like progressing or there's change, it doesn't feel challenging anymore. There can be a number of things that make it feel routine and almost like robotic. Several times that happened to me in my 20-year career in the military. And, being in for a long time, sometimes you get used to these routines, saying the same thing, feeling stuck, things not improving in policy, or seeing the same people every day, or not evolving in your career, whether there's a lack of promotions or lack of movement. It can happen sometimes in anything that you do. But what you want to like take away from that is that sometimes you feeling stuck is because you're just kind of used to it and you don't even see it as stuck, right? You see it as I'm going to work, I'm doing what I need to do and getting paid, doing all these things, right? For me in the military, it was going to work on drill weekends, with the National Guard, or working during the week, or reviewing hundreds of emails like every week, or, if you've gone on vacation, then you see that a lot of emails come in your inbox. So a lot of those things can be routine, but because you've been in it a long time, it's hard to leave because of everything you put into, right? It's like, do I start something over new or do I stay with what I had? I dealt with this for 20 years, obviously, in and out, like different between jobs. When I got promoted, it would feel like I was refreshed and getting a new, a new change in like my responsibilities or being responsible for others, or just going to different locations and figuring out that I had different ways to impact or help other organizations do the same thing that I was doing, but, in a different capacity. All those little things can feel invigorating and like give you like a reset that you need to kind of restart the creative burnout so you don't feel burnt out by it. I would say that I got quite burnt out during COVID. I was still in the National Guard at the time. And because I was in New York, our organization was supporting the state in various locations, whether it be hospitals, security, personal security, airports, etc. That kind of like gave me a little reset, but also I was burnt out because we were working a lot. So while these things can give you a reset, you kind of find yourself going back to the way it was, because then that becomes the new normal. So after putting so long into that, I've realized that I was just like, how long am I going to keep doing this, where I just feel like things aren't changing, or I just don't feel challenged by the work anymore. At that point, my goal was just to make it to the 20 years and then retire from the military. So that way I could, have other different experiences outside of the military. And so that's what you have to really think about, is like, what are you willing to deal with if you give yourself an end date? Perhaps that's what you're working towards, so that you don't feel like you're stuck in a rut. So yeah, now we're going to move on to our next movie element and versus real life comparison. And we're going to take the grain of sand versus the minimal viable start. So what does that mean? When Fantasia was in the process of being destroyed, and then Bastian actually sees the Empress, the childlike Empress, in this nothing in the background, she presents Bastian with a single microscopic grain of sand, which represents the absolute bare minimum required to start over and rebuild Fantasia. So when you look at what kind of experiences, when you think about that, when you decide to rewrite your personal narrative or chase a major life goal, you don't need the whole thing like mapped out, but it does certainly help when you have steps to get there, right? But what you need is what the single grain of sand represents, is like a little something just to get you along to your goal. So that could be a 10-minute habit, something that you do, or a small daily life choice, or a single written commitment, something to help like start that process for you to work towards that goal. So whether it be rebuilding your life or starting a new passion project, for instance, me starting this podcast is a great example of kind of starting something new and needing like that grain of sand. So what did I use in that particular instance? I was thinking about the equipment that I needed to get. So that was a start. It was just figuring out what kind of equipment I needed to get and doing research and what kind of other podcasters used equipment and things of that nature. So those are a relatable experience. And it could, like I said, it could be anything. But when you're starting out and you want to like kind of map out what the things that you need, you're just trying to give that little grain of salt, the smallest possible building block that you need first. It's identifying that building block and then kind of taking that and then seeing how you use that information onto your next step. So using an example of creating little tasks like a checklist. I love checklists. Everybody knows I love checklists, the people that know me. And basically using a checklist to kind of like mark off all the little things. So in my checklist for my podcast, one of them was buy equipment, identify equipment. The next step was buy equipment. And that is basically like the same thing you could do with anything that you do. So I'm a very organized person. So for me, I need some sort of structure. And the way I process how to achieve something, I always do things like step 1, step 2, and so on. This can be similar in writing an outline for a paper or an outline for a project that you're working on and all the different parts of that outline and what you need to accomplish different pieces of that goal. So, and that's what I did. I essentially had a checklist and was going through it, whether it be buying equipment, identifying equipment, setting up the equipment, right? Testing the equipment out. All these things eventually get to your goal of obviously establishing my podcast. Very similar experience that hopefully you could take away from it. Using my example of keeping a book of things to do. So ever since I was in the military, I used to have a little book, a little green book that said, it was really literally called the Things to Do book. It didn't have a fancy name or anything like that. I just jotted down things that needed to occur with my work and then I could cross them out as it was just, checking off the checklist or checking off tasks. Similar idea, or jotting down things in a calendar. I love using my online calendar to document every event or task that I need to do within my calendar, because then I can see it in the day-to-day agenda and see what I need to do in order to make that happen. So I love using that as a way to kind of like mark off things that I do or know that I actually completed those things. So same idea, just different examples of how you can do this and how a little grain of sand can help build into other things and move towards other things. There's an old saying, make a dollar out of 15 cents. And it's really just using that and then kind of using the 15 cents and then kind of doubling it or figuring out ways and how you can like get to that dollar. So essentially using little grains of sand and building more to get to your final goal. So the next element I'm going to be going to is naming the Empress versus reclaiming your identity. So in the movie finale, Bastion spends the whole movie hiding in an attic, watching from the sidelines until he finally finds his voice and the childlike Empress and Atreus talking to him that he needs to get involved in order to save Fantasia. Until he finally finds his voice, he screams out a new name, which is what the childlike Empress wanted him to do. She needed a new name so he can talk with her and figure out how to rebuild Fantasia. And so that actively steps into the narrative to save Fantasia. Like that was the first step. He needed to give her a name and then they could talk about how to rebuild Fantasia. So the real life comparison is you cannot just manifest a dream if you're hiding in the attic of your own life, waiting for the perfect moment. There are no perfect moments. Sometimes you have to take that chance, take a risk, and kind of go for something that you really for a long time wanted to work on, right? Making a goal real requires you to stop playing small. You have to step outside the box. You have to get outside your comfort zone, which can be really hard and scary. I've done it many times throughout my career, even today. Speaking, they say manifestation is real, speaking your intentions into existence. Sometimes that helps too. If that's the kind of person that you work as? Like, do you like to speak your manifestations? Do you like to write them down? Many different things in order for you to get to your goal, right? But the first step really is just kind of looking at it and saying, I'm going to try this and see what happens. Actively claim the identity of the person you want to become before the reality can form around you. You've got to work towards that. So, like, as an example, using this podcast again as a launch, this podcast launch, how uncomfortable it can be to step outside of who you or others see you and just try it, right? People know you for one thing, and then now they're seeing you, wow, this is something that you like and enjoy. And it's just interesting to see how there's different sides to a person's, whole being, right? There's different things that make up everybody. You don't always get to see what makes them happy all the time. They can find joy in many things, but maybe there's one thing that you've never even thought about or knew about that person. So the worst thing is that you can get inside your head, tell yourself, oh, this is not going to work. And, what are you doing? Nobody's going to like it. Everybody's going to write negative feedback about you or not relate to you at all. These are all the worst things that can happen, right? But once again, you don't know unless you try. So the worst thing is that you can't get the negative feedback, or if it doesn't take off the way you thought it would, but you just won't know until you try. And that's why I kind of wanted to work on this podcast and launching it, because it's something I've never tried. It's outside my comfort zone. I have this idea. And so I'm just trying to make it work and learn along the way, right? There's always learning. And I always say that we're human and we make mistakes. And sometimes it takes learning to get to the next level of where you want to be. So make a plan. When things don't go right, just try a different approach. I mean, that's what we all do. We try different things. And I'm a big person of having different courses of action for when one thing fails and you could try a different way. So do that and you see how that works for you. So yeah. The next thing I want to talk about is the power of wishing versus strategic execution, right? So the movie finale element, the Empress tells Bastian that the more he wishes he makes, the more magnificent Fantasia will become, right? So she gave him the grain of sand and said, give me you have to speak all your wishes and dreams and think about that, and Fantasia will be real again. So it's up to him to determine how his imagination and his dreams and hopes and everything helps to rebuild his reality as well as Fantasia's reality. So his imagination directly dictates the physical rebuilding of the reality. That is one of the main parts of the ending of the NeverEnding Story is about him figuring out what does he want to dream. His dreams could be flying on Falcor, the luck dragon, and chasing his bullies down the street. If you remember that from the movie, which was a fantastic part of the ending, it could be, all his wishes, how he deals with his mom's death and, having a better relationship with his dad and all these things, all those wishes, hopes, and dreams just kind of speaking into or thinking into existence. And that's how Bastian helps restore Fantasia. So when we're comparing that, wishes are our ultimate metaphor for our vision, for our personal visions, right? If you limit your imagination because you're afraid of failing, or you build like you restricting your reality, then you're not going to really see the possibilities that can occur when you actually achieve that goal you're trying to achieve. To live a truly fulfilling life, you have to allow yourself to envision the biggest, most unapologetic version of your dreams before you worry about the logistics of executing them, right? I had a dream when I was younger. I used to want to be on radio, and then I never thought about the logistics of how to make that happen because I was young. But I was just like, oh, let me just record myself on a cassette tape over the radio and kind of introduce songs or talk about what's going on. And so those are kind of little things I was just doing impromptu at the time as a kid. But as an adult or when you're older, you want to allow yourself to envision this biggest goal or whatever you want to, this biggest version of what you are trying to achieve, right? And you want to maximize it. So just limiting yourself to little pockets doesn't really help. You have to kind of stretch your imagination essentially. So the more you limit yourself, the more that dream becomes limited. And that's basically what Bastian was doing. He was exploring all these dreams and, imagination and to rebuild Fantasia. And it just kept going. And Fantasia eventually came back to normal. So one way that I do this normally is even using an example of a dream board, right? Everybody has different versions of dream board. My version of dream board could be different from somebody else's. And mostly for me, this is very common, especially this is very common in the entertainment industry. Using a dream board allows you to see the things that might work or might not, right? So you get to just have something in the center, like, the big goal idea. And then you have little branches that goes off of that. And then you start writing ideas. And then you start looking at it, and maybe you may expand on those ideas. Sometimes you're like, oh, this thing didn't work. This is going to stop at this point. So maybe I can't talk about this. Maybe I can't do this towards my dream, right? Maybe it won't work. But it allows you to visually see something and see the possibilities that can occur. Sometimes do these by, like I said before, writing out my outlines. Or you could do a pros and cons, what makes sense, what doesn't, all those kind of things. Everybody, like I said, everybody has different versions of their dream board. It's like what makes sense to you and how you visualize reading those things or seeing those things visually. And then whether you can see that going into your end goal. And then you could start just writing things down and or making corrections and making edits as you go along. So that's always a thing too. I also did this in college, deciding whether I wanted to pursue my master's degree after I completed my bachelor's. I was weighing out the pros and cons, determining like what would this do for my career essentially if I did my master's, and is it helpful to what I'm doing now? Could it be? Could I use it now and then use it later? There was all those different things, right? So I did this and decided that I wanted to pursue my master's degree after doing pros and cons of what I wanted to do, even down to deciding the type of degree it was in. So, and I thought it was super helpful because for me, I had my bachelor's in HR management and I wanted to do something similar in the field because I was working it for so long, but something like kind of different. Some people do their MBA and that's okay too. Some people go into just more in depth, and even some people go into their PhD, which I didn't do, but that's okay. That was my level of like achieving my academic or completing my academic education. But when I weighed out what could be done and how I could do my master's degree and complete it in a certain time and what it took to complete it, and even like figured out when I could end it, when the end date would be, it helped give me a better visual picture of how I can actually really complete this, with the steps, looking at all the things it would take to actually complete it successfully. And eventually I did. So yeah. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is the swamps of sadness versus managing loss and setbacks. So before the movie ends, Atreyu must navigate the swamps of sadness, right? Where the environment itself forces you to sink if you succumb to grief and despair. This is where Atreyu tragically loses his horse, Artax, I mentioned earlier. He sank into the quicksand. Artax gives up and allows himself to be consumed by the swamp. And it's a sad part of the movie because you feel really attached and then you see this horse gone and died. So to see that it happening and then how it impacts Atreyu because this was his companion. And, sometimes that happens when you see things you lose or people that you lose that are important to you or that have had some sort of impact to you over your life. And then see it being consumed and then no longer available to you and you no longer have that. So when we're comparing to a real experience on the path to any major personal breakthrough, you will hit low points. That's kind of a given. Sometimes you hit low points, sometimes it's high points all the time, but eventually something won't work out and you have to decide how to maneuver when that low point hits you, right? So where you have doubt, you have emotional exhaustion that are trying to pull you under. You feel like that could be at those times of those low points. And that's what it feels like. Sometimes you just start doubting yourself. You're emotionally exhausted and you just feel weighed by those emotions and those things and those feelings. And you are trying to figure out how to maneuver out of that rut and move on to your next thing. So if this didn't work out, how do I maneuver to something that will work out? The danger isn't hitting the swamp. It's letting the heavy weight of a past failure convincing you to stop moving. In order for you to keep your dreams alive, you have to acknowledge the pain of a setback or a low point. But you have to do this by moving your feet constantly, moving your feet forward, not stepping back. So the sadness doesn't personally consume your momentum or drag you down. And like I said, we're all human, right? So sometimes setbacks hit us for a little bit and then we get right back into it, right? I think that it's important to acknowledge, that you can deal with setbacks and low points and work your way out of that, just like anything. It just takes you a second to kind of reflect what happened, what you did wrong. Maybe you didn't do anything wrong. Maybe you just need something to be like, all right, I tried it this way. Let me try that again, but doing it this way. It gives you an opportunity to really look at different avenues of completing something where you want to go. And so as an example of like, for instance, maybe you're out searching for a job and you haven't found one yet and you've been unemployed for quite some time and you've been trying and then something didn't happen and you were almost there at the finish line and then you didn't get it. So it's not seeing it as a failure, and it's hard, right? You take it personal. You're like, why didn't they like me? What did I not do right? But the thing is that it doesn't always work out to your favor. And, maybe it's not something you did. Maybe somebody was just way more exceptional than you were. And you just keep working on your interview skills. You keep working at presenting yourself a certain way. And that's how you have to keep looking at it. Because at some point you will get that dream role. So ask yourself, could you have done this differently or maybe just resolve that, or maybe just resolve at the end of the day that it may not have been the place for you and to try different approaches next time. You're at that point of almost getting a job, whatever the case may be. So also you can do this with pros and cons lists or even working out possible ways something might end to prepare yourself mentally for the things that might not work out. I think that's happens to us a bunch of times of us in between looking for jobs or looking for something that we are working towards to achieving. Maybe it didn't work out the first time, but knowing that there's a possibility that it might not have happened the first time, but maybe the second or third, or even down the line is super important because then it keeps you motivated to wanting to keep trying, to keep doing it, to keep working at it and to keep heading towards that goal eventually. So I know these things can be hard. You feel like you're stuck in that, like a tray, you're stuck in that grief and despair because you just lost your horse or you lost something important to you. And you feel like that's keeping you stuck. So you want to take that and kind of maneuver a way around that so that you don't get stuck. And as we are closing out on all the comparisons, the movie elements to real life elements, it's just interesting. Like I grew up watching this movie and I've watched it so many times. I think I watched it in the last 2 years. In 2 years that I watched it because of the hype with Stranger Things. And I'm like, I really wanted to see it again. It was a while. So seeing how as a kid watching this and seeing it as an adult through different lens, it's so important because obviously I've matured, I've had experiences, and I can really relate not to just the child version of me watching that movie or having my hopes and dreams and what I wanted to do with my life or what I wanted to do with family or friendships, anything like that. It's just seeing how I've taken all those points from these movies, from this movie in particular, and was like that sometimes you can dream big. You can dream big and it's okay. And sometimes maybe you have a long pause in between and you're going to go back to it at some point. But I think it's just the knowing that there is opportunity for you, but you have to take that step in order to do it and to get to achieve that level. So I really love this movie. If you haven't seen it yet, it's available on various streaming platforms, and it's just a fun movie. Obviously, the graphics in the 80s weren't the best, but I think that's also part of the nostalgia and part of loving it is just knowing that it was just a different time before the big technology and CGI and all this. And it's just I just love that movie. So I hope if you had a chance to watch it, I definitely recommend it. So now we're going to be wrapping up a little bit, but just thank you for listening all the way through. I mean, it's really helpful to helping me grow my podcast. So thank you. So the big takeaway from this episode is that The ultimate lesson of the never ending story is that endings, even total catastrophic ones, are rarely permanent stops. When your goals or plans completely dissolve into the nothing, like the movie, you're never truly left with zero. You just kind of have to start over and reset and figure out where you want to go. You always want to retain that single grain of sand. So whether it be your core skills, your mindset, your motivation to even keep doing something and trying something new, and even your capacity to reinvent yourself, something that is so outside, your body, outside the norm of what you're used to, what you've been doing for the last whatever amount of years. The destruction of an old plan just simply gives you a blank canvas to build more. So now that we have officially made it to episode 2, once again, everyone, I want to thank everyone who's reached out, like when I premiere my trailer and the first episode. So thank you. Stepping behind this mic was a massive leap out of my own comfort zone, but hearing how much people enjoyed like the first episode and resonated with it with their own real world shifts made it completely worth it. So I am so incredibly grateful to you to have you along for this ride, and I can't wait to keep exploring these endings together. Thanks for listening to the Finale Compass. Make sure to hit subscribe, leave a review, and join me next week where we'll be auditing another great ending. See you then. Bye.